Hello, in this video I want to respond to Joshua Charles and specifically address the section of his argument where he claims that Sola Scriptura is logically incoherent. Let's start by summarizing his argument before I respond. Charles argues that since the Westminster Confession of Faith says all things necessary for salvation, faith, and life are either set down in Scripture or may be deduced from it, and since Scripture doesn't include a list of its own books, we can't know what Scripture is from Scripture. Therefore, according to him, the Westminster Confession ends up being self-contradictory. His argument can be laid out like this. 1. If all things necessary for salvation, faith, and life are either set down in Scripture or may be deduced from it, as the Westminster Confession asserts, then the identity of Scripture itself must be either set down in Scripture or deducible from it. 2. The identity of Scripture is not set down in Scripture nor deducible from it. 3. Therefore, not all things necessary for salvation, faith, and life are set down in Scripture or deducible from it. Now, at first glance, this seems airtight, but the key claim is in premise 2, that the canon is not deducible from Scripture or set down in it. That's where the problem lies, and that's the premise I want to directly challenge. Michael Kruger's self-authenticating model of the canon shows that the identity of Scripture is indeed deducible from Scripture, understood within the broader context of divine revelation. The church did not begin with absolutely nothing. The church received a pre-existing body of divine revelation, including the Old Testament, Christ's oral teaching, apostolic authority, most of the New Testament, and the rule of faith, which together formed an epistemic environment that made the church capable of recognizing Scripture when it came across it. For example, the requirement that Scripture be apostolic comes directly from divine revelation itself. John 14:26, 1 Thessalonians 2:13. This is not something that comes from some later tradition. So when the early church used apostolic origin and orthodoxy to assess its books, it was applying revealed criteria, reasoning from revelation itself, not from outside of it. So here's my counter argument, also in a syllogism. Premise 1. If all things necessary for salvation, faith, and life are either set down in Scripture or may be deduced from it, then the identity of Scripture must be set down in Scripture or deducible from it. 2. The identity of Scripture is deducible from Scripture. Conclusion 3. Therefore, the Westminster Confession's claim is not self-contradictory. It's deducible from Scripture. Now, you may object that this approach is circular, that you can't use Scripture to identify what counts as Scripture, but that misunderstands the argument. Again, the church did not begin with absolutely nothing. We are not trying to reconstruct the canon from nothing. The church already possessed a pre-existing foundation of divine revelation, which included Scripture. Therefore, it wasn't assuming the canon to prove the canon, but recognizing Scripture based on what had already been revealed. This process is not viciously circular, but organically self-authenticating. Divine revelation confirms itself through multiple interlocking means, both oral and written. So here's the causal chain of knowledge. Christ comes and teaches with authority. His teaching is authenticated by signs and miracles. This is how people knew that Christ was from God. Christ, who is from God, then appoints apostles as his mouthpieces. The apostles likewise teach with authority, confirmed by signs and miracles. This is how the church knew that apostolic teaching comes from God, and they could then apply this apostolic criterion when assessing books. How do we know that a book comes from God? Well, if the apostles come from God, then the book should be apostolic. Therefore, the church could recognize which books were Scripture by appealing to the foundation of divine revelation they already possessed. In this way, Scripture helps identify Scripture, and the canon is known by good and necessary consequence from divine revelation itself, satisfying the Westminster Confession and preserving the coherence of Sola Scriptura. Thus, Joshua Charles' argument fails. Now let me quickly respond to a few common objections. Objection 1, epistemic ambiguity. You might say, fine, Christ taught, he did miracles, he appointed apostles, etc., but where do we know all of this from? Ultimately, we know it from the very Scriptures you're trying to prove. So even your revealed foundation depends on the authority of the text whose status as Scripture is the very thing in question. Now here's how I answer that objection. This misunderstands the nature of the dialectic. We're not trying to prove Scripture from scratch without any Scripture. We are already presupposing Scripture. We are asking whether the identity of Scripture can be deduced from Scripture. We're already presupposing it in this context. This means we begin with the portions of Revelation already accepted in the church, already given in the church. The Old Testament, Christ's oral teachings, the apostolic teachings, and the undisputed New Testament texts. From there, we reason outward. This is not circular. It's an organic development grounded in revealed premises. Objection 2. The rule of faith is too vague. You claim the early church had a rule of faith, but where was it codified with enough precision to function as an objective canon filter? The answer is the rule of faith in my argument is never meant to function in isolation. It serves as one piece of a larger cumulative case, which also includes Christ's commissioning of the apostles, the oral teachings, the signs and wonders confirming their authority, the Old Testament, and the undisputed New Testament writings. All of these together reinforce one another and allow the early church to recognize genuine Scripture without appealing to some extrinsic, infallible magisterium. Objection 3. Deduction requires certainty of premises. Your model assumes that divine revelation, oral and written, provided the church with the ability to deduce the canon. But deduction only works if the premises are themselves certain. Here's my answer. Strictly speaking, deduction doesn't require epistemic certainty for each premise. Only that, if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. And when assessing the canon, we aren't demanding infallible premises to gain rational confidence. We're using divinely revealed criteria, apostolicity, orthodoxy, etc., that were received and affirmed by the early church to judge other writings. That's how the canon was recognized, not by human infallibility, but by faithful reasoning from divine revelation. Objection 4. Protestant appeals to providential recognition undermine the argument. Now you might say that my response leans too heavily on what some Protestants call providential exposure. Michael Kruger uses this in his book. This is the idea that the church came to recognize the canon over time under God's providence. But doesn't this happen outside of Scripture and therefore undermine Sola Scriptura? My answer is no. The expectation that God would providentially ensure the church receives His word is not an extra biblical assumption. It's a conclusion drawn from Scripture itself. God repeatedly promises to guide His people, John 16:13, to equip them for every good work, and to be with His church until the end of the age. Therefore, the concept of providential recognition of the canon is a theological application of God's revealed character, not a foreign tradition imported into the system. So all in all, Charles' argument fails, and also arguments that are similarly structured, these other canon conundrum arguments, they fail as well. Anyways, I hope this video has been helpful to you, and as always, cling to Christ and to His word.